Okay, we'll get started and people can join as they are able. My name is Alex Lyon. I'm a pediatric neuro-oncologist at Riley and the Associate Director of the Evans Center for Religious and Spiritual Values in Health at IU Health. And I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Larry Kripe, who is a professor of medicine in the Division of Hematology Medical Oncology at the IU School of Medicine. He specializes in the care of adults with acute and chronic leukemias and related diseases. He leads the multidisciplinary cancer care roadmap project team's development of interactive digital resources to support communication and decision making in cancer. And the goal is to assure that people with cancer receive evidence based care consistent with their values, salient goals, and fully informed preferences. Dr. Kripe serves as the editor-in-chief of the NCI PDQ Supportive and Palliative Care Board, which maintains evidence-based summaries of topics in supportive and palliative care for healthcare providers and patients. He founded the Complete Life program of the Indiana University Melvin and Bryn Simon Cancer Center. Complete Life provides psychosocial, complementary, and arts-based services for individuals with cancer. Finally, Dr. Kripe is a published writer. His essays and poetry have appeared in such publications as the Journal of American Medical Association and an anthology, At the End of Life, True Stories About How We Die. He formerly wrote and read Grace Notes, Reflections on Living with Serious Illnesses at the End of Life, that were broadcast on the nationally syndicated radio program Sound Medicine. And take it away, Dr. Kripe.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you everybody for being here this afternoon. Before I begin my presentation, I do want to start with a few thank yous to some of my collaborators. First of all, I want to thank the IU Health Values Fund for supporting some of the work you're about to see that I will share with you this afternoon. I have to say I've submitted my share of unfunded grants and I appreciated getting funded, but almost more than that was the first time it was rejected. The advice I got from the review committee was very helpful, so I appreciate that. Two people I need to thank. One is Skip Comer of the Luddy School of Informatics here on campus. Skip is an amazing programmer, and I don't use many digital applications, but Skip is always able to translate what I'm thinking into a workable prototype. And then my colleague of a number of years, Ann Cottingham, I could go on and on about Ann's virtues, but I'm very appreciative because I know the work that I've done and I'm trying to do, the quality of it is always better because of Ann's guidance. Today, we're going to talk about, I'm going to share with you two resources that are under development. The first one is the goal activity. This is an activity designed to help patients and caregivers identify, evaluate, and communicate their goals. And then a project that is less mature than that called the Mind Map, which is an interactive interface designed to help oncologists and patients and caregivers analyze and then communicate their preferences around potential options, harms, and benefits. So I'll talk about both of those today. Before I take a deep dive into each of those resources, I do want to spend a moment and just acknowledge from a larger standpoint what's trying to happen here. So when I think about what I'm interested in, I'm aware that in the mid-1980s, the support study was published. So people have had this thought for a long time that if you could solve gaps or shortfalls in health-related communication, you would be able to improve health-related outcomes. That, for a lot of reasons, has been a tougher nut to crack, I think, than the optimistic start of the support intervention. In part, it's due to what I think Iris Murdoch summarized very well in this quote, and that is man is the creature that makes a picture of himself and comes to resemble the picture. So I think this early premise made a lot of sense. And I think, like many premises, it takes a lot of discipline for us to try to look beyond and say, okay, what hasn't worked, what has worked, and how do we need to adjust what the foundation of our work is. To do that, I'm actually going to share two quotes from a novel, Never Let Me Go, that was written by the Nobel laureate Kazuo Ishiguro, called Never Let Me Go. To give you a little background, the novel actually features a small country in which human cloning is allowed to happen. And these individuals who are cloned are destined to become organ donors, and that's their sole purpose. And as they're raised in these schools by guardians. And the narrator relates this one instance where some students, clone students who are destined to be organ donors, are joking about what they'll do when they graduate from this school. Now she knows, the guardian knows, that they're going to become organ donors, but these kids are kidding about going to California to become actors. And she erupts and she says, "The problem as I see it is that you've been told and not told. You've been told, but none of you really understand. But if you're going to have decent lives, then you've got to know and know properly." And in this episode in the novel, she then sits them down and is ready to tell them. But the narrator points out that my guess is once she had seen the puzzled, uncomfortable faces in front of her, she realized the impossibility of completing what she'd started. And as a clinician and as someone who thinks about the issue of communication gaps in cancer care, those words, when I read them earlier this year, really resonated with me. Because oftentimes when I'm doing this work or when I'm with people, it just seems overwhelmingly impossible to do what I think we should do in conversation. So I'll just leave you with three observations before we make a deep dive. First of all, we all see different gaps in communication. And this guardian was troubled by that gap, but others were not. And there's not a straight line between hearing and knowing and then acting. And the narrator talks about this later on in the book, and she realizes that none of the people who were there who had talked about it before really remembered the same conversation with this guardian. And then I think, at least for me, it's good to remember that there are good reasons we avoid certain conversations. And those are reasons we probably need to overcome, but they're not easy to overcome. All right. So now I'm going to introduce you to the goal activity. So goal-related communication has been a topic of some interest for a number of years. Early on in the advanced care planning interventions, I think there was an intuition that strikes me as very correct, and that is there has to be something besides sort of objective analysis of outcomes that distinguishes what we want, how much we want it, and what we're willing to invest in that. Also, more recent work shows that in cancer, patients and caregivers identify goal-related communication as a marker of high-quality care. And there are relationships that have been demonstrated in cross-sectional and longitudinal studies between evidence of goal-related communication and improved outcomes. The gaps, however, is that patients and caregivers report few opportunities to discuss their goals. We conducted a systematic review and published it a couple years ago, and there's great confusion about what it actually means to have goal-related conversations. When should you have them? Why should you have them? And what will be different if you have them? So there's not, while we can talk about goal-related communication or goals of care, there's a great heterogeneity in actually what that means from people who think about this. And then I think it's fair to say the results of trials to test interventions to increase goal-related communication are equivocal. So some have had no real impact, some have increased the frequency of these conversations without changing outcomes. Most of the interventions that I'm aware of and have thought about really are based upon prompting people, patients and clinicians to have these conversations. And as we were doing work in goals in advanced cancer, one of the things that occurred to me is that it seemed difficult, to say the least, to ask a person to think about their goals without providing them some means to think about their goals. So I don't know if you've ever had somebody ask you about your goals, but I think it's a bit of a deer in a headlight moment. And especially, I think, if you're getting medical care for serious illness. So the idea basically is to develop an application that can help patients identify, evaluate, and communicate their goals. So what this looks like is, if you look in the upper left-hand corner, what patients do is they sign into a secure website and they have a deck of what are called patient goals. They then deal one card at a time electronically, and the format is the same. So there will be a statement. There's a slider bar that they're allowed to evaluate how much they agree with the statement. They can also skip the statement if it's upsetting to them. This, and in the background, we can then generate state summaries, and we can generate summaries that summarize the evaluations from multiple different times. And we also cluster the statements into various types of goal statements. And then ultimately, what we want to test in an ongoing pilot is whether providing patients access to this activity, and then oncologists and patients the results of their evaluations, whether we can change the nature of the interactions. So the work starts in a study that I did with my colleague Kevin Rand a number of years ago, where we want to understand the life and treatment goals of patients with advanced cancer. And I'll show you some of the results of that study in a moment. After that is when I became interested in how could we translate this knowledge into something useful for patients. So we interviewed oncology clinicians, patients and caregivers, a variety of people, to try to understand, could we develop a consensus list of goal statements? And then we conducted the pre-pilot, which I'll present in a moment, looking at acceptability, usability. We also want to understand how goals are discussed in advanced cancer. And then we want to evaluate the statements for what I will call informativeness. And that has led to now an ongoing goal pilot study that we're recruiting patients for. So this is data from the study I did with Kevin. And basically what an interviewer did was ask patients their treatment goals, ask them their life goals, and then we asked them to rank them, and we asked them to identify the most important goal. So not unexpected, the most common treatment goal was something like fight cancer or to be cured. And that actually is the paramount goal. So that goal dominates people's thinking when they're only allowed to nominate one goal. What's interesting, I won't go through this in detail, is that while patients are generally able to identify treatment and life goals, there is some overlap. And a part of that, I think, is an interdependence that makes sense, in that if you want to see, for example, a child graduate from high school, you're aware you have to live long enough to see that, and that live longer becomes a treatment goal, or cure becomes a treatment goal. But there's also the reasons why people want to do those things, and those are also quite important to people. We also did a preliminary analysis trying to understand were there what I call, and I'll explain this term in a moment, informative covariates, meaning that do these goals give us insight into how the patient's thinking? And interestingly, people who hold on to cure tend to be younger. They tend to have a worse performance status. They have more symptoms of depression, and they don't really anticipate achieving that goal, but they're not quite ready to apparently let go of that goal. And I think that will come to that point later on in the talk. So we created this format. We had 33 goal statements that we skip coded into this deck of goal statement cards. And we had three aims. One, we wanted to once again understand how the goals of patients influence their cancer treatment decisions in their mind. We want to understand their reactions and impressions of the patients and caregivers to the goal activity itself. Is it usable? Is it acceptable? What are the pain points for it? And then we want to analyze evaluations of candidate goal statements. So this is just a table giving you a sense of, we had 23 patients, 9 caregivers. So that is, on a side note, is one of the challenges. So we had always thought about this as a triad: oncology clinicians, patients, and caregivers. And many caregivers thus far have been reluctant to participate in this. Most of the patients were currently receiving anti-cancer therapy. I don't have it summarized on this slide, but we had asked what decisions had been made in the last 3 months, and most patients felt some decision impacting their treatment had been made within 3 months of enrollment. Mostly people had stable disease. And then in just a simple yes/no question, 7 patients stated they had conversations about goals with the oncologist, and 13 patients said they had ongoing conversations about goals with their caregiver. So what are some of the things we learned about goal-related communication? First of all, the language of goals and goal conversations is not necessarily the conversations that people use. Oftentimes they talked about priorities or other terms that we assume were goal equivalent. But the first thing is treatment-related goals are always prioritized as a rule. They feel that the goals are those goals are the purview of the oncologist. That's why they have a relationship with the oncologist. Also, which we had seen in Kevin's study, to the extent that they felt oncologists knew their goals, they felt that was a marker that the oncologist took the time to get to know them. Discussions of goals, for the most part, were at the oncologist's discretion, and patients reported and understood that there was often not enough time, or that that's just not how the oncologist wanted to use the time they had. Conversely, most patients felt they had conversations about goals with families and friends. And interestingly, of the 9 caregivers, they all felt that they talked about goals frequently with their, typically it was a spouse. In terms of how we might imagine this intervention would influence decision-making, we want to understand, so as in every population of people with cancer, as far as I know, that has been studied, there's a range of decision-making roles. A significant minority of patients just want to defer the decision-making to the oncologist. They just want to understand why. A minority describe themselves as active partners, often in terms of at least having to set limits to what they might be willing to do. Participants who had experience in goal-related communication or something similar felt that their goals were very important to their treatment decisions. Interestingly, once again, there's a bit of a trend that we're still trying to sort through, that it was more a negative goal, that they would listen to their oncologist unless it tended to violate something that was more important to them. Nonetheless, I would say the majority of participants describe this alignment between goals and treatment decisions. And it was interesting how it sort of arose. So I'm going to take a moment and read two quotes from patients. And here's the first that to me sort of felt like it arose more deliberately. And it goes as follows. He knows what I want to do and strive for. I don't know if we directly ask those specific questions with each other, but it's talked about. Because at first, when I first had it, I was like, let's go after it as aggressive as possible. But the fact that it's stage 4 already, you've got to think about your body and your quality of life, and you don't want to destroy your body right away. So this is, I don't want to call it magical thinking, but there is this sort of magical element to it where people feel it's known, but it's not quite known how it's known. And then there's this evolution that happens, and this quote will give you a sense of that. Getting to know him through my 3rd remission has really been different. I now feel like we're on this team to do what I want to do, which I didn't see before. I'm not saying that he was opposed to it, but I definitely didn't have a connection with him during the 1st remission. In the 2nd remission, it was a little bit okay. But during this 3rd remission, I feel like we're playing chess together and we're on the same team. And I feel a much deeper connection and the ability to share more. And here's how it originated. He started asking about what I was reading and noticed I was going back to school. And I felt it showed that he cared about my personal goals outside of cancer. And that made me feel really seen. And these type of data are very impactful because I think, to me anyway, as I think about the intervention element of what we're trying to do, we're clearly going to have to accommodate a wide range of how these kind of conversations come about naturally and how we can enhance that, as opposed to think we're starting from ground zero and nothing's being done. All right, so now I'm going to shift away and I'm going to introduce this concept of informativeness. So I absolutely believe we should understand people as people, and that includes understanding their goals. But within the context of this activity, I was looking for this informativeness that would help me as a clinician, for example, understand how those goals might influence treatment decisions and decision making. And so I'm going to show you some data about the actual evaluations of the goal statements by these subjects. And we look basically for, were there variations in subject responses? Is there variation over time? Is there variation associated with trade-off statements? And could we find any correlation with outcome variables, covariates? So these are whisker plots. So there are 33 goal statements. And this is just a very high level view of what variation in responses were. Now, this may not be absolutely true, but intuitively, I believe the more variation is going to give you more opportunity for conversation. So without trying to tell you what these statements are, clearly it seems like statements where there's a very tight cluster at complete agreement. It might be important to know that person's attitudes or goals around that, or how they feel about that goal statement, but I'm not sure it gives much room for conversation. Whereas some of these, where there's a significant variation, where there's what I would call ambivalence with people not feeling strongly one way or the other, that to me potentially would be a more informative goal, or could be a more informative goal statement to move decision-making along. This is an example of the goal statements that vary with trade-offs. So the first one to the far left is I do not want to die connected to life-supporting machines, and most people strongly agreed with that. But then when we took that stem and said, but there may be a chance of recovery, people sort of broadened the range of evaluations. And also people were willing to evaluate that even if I die sooner, I would still not want to die on life support machine. And I think that, and these statements are embedded throughout the goal activity, and our qualitative analysis of their response indicates they're aware of that and they were challenged by that, but it was also acceptable. So once again, to me, this is some sense that these are the kind of statements that may allow everyone to pause and say, can you tell me more about that? Let me explain how that might influence my recommendation as one of your physicians. So we feel quite positive about that finding. In terms of the covariates, so this is both to understand who might benefit the most from evaluating these statements, but also there's a big question in my mind that as we try to get preliminary evidence of effectiveness, what are those outcome variables that we may want to assess? I'll just go through the first column, and this basically shows, which makes sense, that how people feel tends to strongly influence how they evaluate statements, say, about side effects and quality of life. So that's encouraging to us that we saw the relationships you would somewhat anticipate. Now, of course, I'll go ahead and answer a thought in somebody's mind, is that we also obviously need to be aware that we don't want just what we anticipate, but we want to discover new things. So anyway, this data gave us, allowed us to revise the goal statements, and then we are now in a pilot study. So some of the next steps are, in the pilot study, we're going to ask the question, how do we integrate the goal activity into clinical oncology care? Will we be able to, will patients use it? Will oncologists pay attention to it? If patients use it and oncologists pay attention to it, will they talk about it? And how will that change the nature of their interactions? Once again, we want to know covariates to understand both confounders and possible outcome measures. And then, which will lead us to the next part, is how do we better translate goal statements into decisions? So it's nice to have an activity. We certainly want to encourage conversations, but as a clinician and as somebody trying to intervene in this area, I also am very aware we want to impact. We want to change things that are happening in a way that potentially will improve the quality of care. So that leads me to talking about the next, this will be a more brief presentation, and then I'll take questions. And that is the concept of mind maps. So in the left panel, this is my view of human communication, is that it's really hard for us to get outside of our own head, our own perspectives. And that if we are merely exchanging things verbally, we often don't get out of our own head and often don't get out of our own perspectives. And perhaps worse, we're under the impression we've done a really good job sharing what we think and our perspectives. And so this concept of mind maps, actually, Ron Epstein, a communication scholar who's quite influential, proposed this idea a number of years ago called a shared mind. That perhaps what we should do is think about the principles of metacognition and not think about communication as me sharing with you what I'm thinking as a direct line, but to put something out there and look at it together. And so the idea is just that, is to create an interactive interface where what the oncologist or the patient are thinking can be reflected in something that they both can interact with by moving tokens and thinking about things. And so perhaps that will reveal areas where we think we're thinking about the same thing, but we're not. All right, so that's a bit, I'll put some meat on those bones next. Why did we focus on harms and benefits? Well, there's several reasons. First of all, they're of central importance to most models of decision making. There's lots of empiric data that both physicians and patients are overly optimistic about the benefits and underappreciate the potential harms, which may drive decisions that clearly are really not consistent with people's preferences. It's also, as when I talk to clinicians, and we've interviewed a fair number now, there's this tension that I think is out there that I'm data driven, but I can't remember all the data. And so I rely on this sort of gist of what the data show. And that clearly, in my mind, is an impediment to really good communication around harms and benefits. There's well-documented physician variation in practice that leads to different outcomes. And often those physician variations in practice are tied back to different ways in which the oncologist thinks about the data. And then I just think, as someone who's fascinated with human communication, I think this is one of the most fundamental issues, is how do we really share our mental activity with one another? And this is just a mental activity designed to choose between two or more options. I'm going to go through this in the spirit of time. So this is what the mind map looks like. And we, as I'll show you, we have tested it for chronic leukemia. The idea is basically very straightforward, that there are three types of information. You need to know benefits, you need to know harms, you need to know options. And that intuitively or objectively, whatever adverb you want to use, we somehow evaluate either how acceptable or how important benefits are, or how acceptable harms are to us. And then there's a phrase that has been around forever, as far as I know, the harm-benefit ratio. And what does that really mean? What does that look like? So the idea is you start here, and with a series of showing the contents of each deck, moving the harms in terms of their acceptability, the benefits in terms of their desirability, you create a surface on which you can start thinking about individual options, both in terms of how their individual harms and benefits compare, and then how sort of the net harm benefit ratio for each option compares. So that's the basic idea. This is coded. We have videos of this. We can manipulate it. We have an interface where a clinician can create their own harms and benefits and options if they so desire. So what we've done, because I wanted a rapid design cycle, is we do internet recruited simulated patients. And I'm going to show you one of our most recent studies. So we basically recruit through these sites that you pay subjects. We introduce them to the concept of a chronic leukemia. They then read a vignette, and they're asked to imagine they have the chronic leukemia and they now have to make a treatment decision. We then randomize them to a verbal control, and we randomize them to one of the mind map conditions. We then measure decision preparedness. They choose a preferred option. We measure decision satisfaction, and then we assign them to an adverse event. So the option they chose, they experience the most serious adverse event. And the vignette ends with the adverse event not fully resolved. And we did that because when we resolved the event, the subjects didn't perceive a lot of harm. And then we measured decision regret. It took us several tries to get the decision measures down and to show that we had good Cronbach alphas and that they worked. So we've done this, and this is the results. And basically the point I'm going to try to convince you of is we're actually seeing a difference in simulated patients in a simulated decision making. So this first, it doesn't matter the details, but there's a variety of options. So the mind map is set up to favor this option, and in fact, patients or simulated patients are more likely to prefer it. The other thing which we were not necessarily anticipating is that more patients in the verbal only, the sort of usual care, defer the decision to the oncologist than they do in the mind map. And interestingly, this tendency to defer is associated with less accurate information recall. So, you know, you can talk about what's an adequate control for this, but we think within the context of the experiment, we have a pretty interesting control that demonstrates some differences in the simulated subject's decision. We also saw that the three measurements of decision quality, preparedness, satisfaction, and regret, all favored the mind map intervention. So we're at a point now where we're pretty confident that we're doing something that may be relevant to human decision making. We have shared the mind map interface with a small number of patients, and we're planning to expand that. And they also gave us a lot of positive encouragement. So the idea is that if you think about the benefit and harms evaluations, those are probably going to be influenced in part by patients' goals. And so we can begin to imagine that this can be a sequence. First of all, they can be standalones, but this could also be a sequence of eliciting patient goals around the time of decision making, exploring how they value both benefits and harms, and seeing where there's alignment or malalignment. So that's work is ongoing with the pilot study. In terms of the next step, the mind map interface is just something we came up with. I'm not wedded to it, so we're going to try to optimize it. Is it comprehensible? Does it really clarify? We're designing and testing alternative interfaces through SKIP at the Luddy School. We have some students doing a capstone project that are going to take a step back and say, what are alternative interfaces? We also have just finalized the design, and SKIP is coding a process that actually begins with the patient's evaluations. So the mind map I shared with you is very physician-centric. The physician sort of shares what he or she is thinking and then elicits the patient's reactions. But we think there should be ways for the patient evaluations to happen first, and then that directly informs the placement of the harms and benefits along the axes. In pancreatic cancer and in acute leukemia, we're trying to understand in greater detail to what extent are harms and benefits really the main drivers of physicians' decisions? And the answer is to a pretty good extent, but not exclusively. And then we're characterizing what else do they use, because we want to be able to account for that within this intervention design to support communication. So with that, I am going to end. I appreciate the opportunity to present this data. We're quite excited about it, but as we started out at the beginning, there's been a lot of good ideas tested over the years, and this is a tough nut to crack, but thank you for your support and your attention. And I should have stopped sharing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kreit. I believe we have some time for questions and comments.
I've got a couple questions. This was amazing. And I think your reflections on the type of communication and in the quote from the Ishiguro novel, I think were just amazing and really got me thinking kind of about the nonverbal way that some people feel heard, when really, if you kind of actually look at the dialogue, maybe they haven't had this explicit discussion of what are your goals? Well, my goals are X. And I just think that's so interesting. And so I was kind of thinking about that through all of what I was listening to. And one of the things I'm just curious about is what you think the mechanism is of participating in one of these exercises with respect to decision satisfaction and regret. And I kind of wonder, is it that is the important thing that they wind up matching, that we talk about goal concordance, and it's been hotly debated about whether that's a good outcome. In fact, there was an article within the last 6 months, I think, really criticizing this idea that we can never measure or reach goal concordance. And so is it the fact that the person is, truly reflected on their goals and chosen a treatment that matches their goals? Or is it perhaps just the exercise of knowing that someone cares about their goals? They're thinking about their goals. They might even be formulating them as they do the exercise because they don't necessarily have, pre-specified goals. So maybe it's just sort of the act of being thoughtful that takes them to some different place that's going to make them feel better about the whole thing. And I wonder what you think of that. Like, what is the mechanism that is making these results turn out with better decision satisfaction and lower regret?
So I'm going. Thank you for those comments and questions. I'm going to think about decision satisfaction as a much different measure than regret. Because the regret is really, we put them through the stress test of an adverse event that's quite serious. So I think it's really just the fact that they think, wow, somebody has taken more time than I've ever had somebody take to try to help me, and fill in the blank, understand, make a decision, feel heard. And that bias came a number of years ago when we did the first focus group of this huge gargantuan idea I had called the roadmap. And we showed it to people and they loved it. But as I was listening to them, I thought, there's no way you know all the bells and whistles. And that's when it occurred to me, maybe it's simply the act that we brought something with bells and whistles, right? They didn't care what was in the toolbox. It was like, thank God somebody recognizes I need some tools. So we've struggled with getting so I'll now address your question directly. We struggled with getting a trust in the oncologist measure in the simulation, because there hasn't been so in the next experiment, we think we finally have one, and we think what this is going to be is trust. It's going to be some element of trust based upon the fact that this is something different than they've ever seen before, and they're going to believe the simulated oncologist cares enough to do something they haven't seen before. And then that we're thinking that's going to be the mediator of this effect, but we'll see.
Dr. Kreit, that reminds me of, times I've had families who have had adverse events, and they were known ahead of time. And one of the things one of the families told me was that it helped having the sense that we were carrying the burden of that together. And it reminds me of almost like attachment theory.
Yeah.
That the process of communication forms a sense of accompaniment, so that if there is an adverse event, it doesn't feel like it's the parent's fault.
Yeah, I think that that's true in clinical medicine. Absolutely. I think it's about I think when I think about my own practice, so I'm not going to talk about anybody but my own practice. I think there are times where I walk out of a room where I think I just rushed in, rushed out, didn't convey any humanity, didn't convey anything. And if people are doing okay, they sort of accept that. It's really about how do you need to be present when people aren't doing okay, right? And once again, I just believe these kind of interventions in part is a flag that's waved, and people just see it as somebody trying to do something extra for us.
I have just another thought. I know that I think it's great to use these online panels of people, which I think is really cool. I do, and I think it's an awesome first step because they're easily accessible and lower risk to have certain hypothetical situation. But I always wonder about the difference between hypothetical and real decision making, and that you don't have, of course, the high anxiety, personal feelings, fears of death. They're not quite the same in a hypothetical. So do you have plans to test that now in a population of people with a condition?
Yes. So we specifically have focused on the chronic leukemias, specifically chronic lymphocytic leukemia. So this will not get to 100% to your concern about but the nice thing about CLL is there's a whole cohort of people who live anticipating the treatment decision, right? So they're told that they're observed, but they're going to have to face a treatment decision. So the next step, once we, with a wide range of people, optimize the interface to make sure the interface makes sense, we will then recruit from multiple different institutions, people with CLL that are undergoing observation, and take them through a similar simulation of the decision making and see whether we see similar things. I don't, in terms of intervening actually in the clinic, one of the things that's out there that keeps me up some nights is, physicians respond to a lot of things with high goal of social desirability. So they tell you what they do because they think that's what they're supposed to be doing. So we really need to unpack through just, I think, lots of interviews initially, what is it that drives the physician's decisions, and what is it that they think they're communicating, and what are they actually communicating? So we need to optimize it for both sets of users, and then we'll think about an intervention study.
Hi, Dr. Kripe. My name is Marcos. I'm one of I'm a chaplain, director of chaplaincy at Riley. Just out of curiosity, so some of the questions that ask the patient, those statements, I will like treatment offered as long as so there's a bias with the I. And I'm just wondering, has there been any thought given to what if the patient if the patient comes from a set of communities for whom there is really no I, that what you lead with is the community, the we. Have you accounted for any sort of that bias in those questions?
Yeah, that's an awesome point. Thank you for making that point. Not very much, and certainly not as deliberately as you've just caused me to think about it. We do have a complementary caregiver set of goals where the caregiver tells the caregiver basically says, this is what I think my spouse's or whatever the relationship goals are. But in terms of actually thinking, so we tried to imagine that could improve within the patient's smaller community, those kind of questions and conversations. But in terms of, that's really provocative. I will stop talking because I haven't thought about it enough to have anything intelligent to say. But thank you for making that point.
I appreciate your honesty. Thank you.
But let me just say in closing, if you have some thoughts about how to do it, or if you'd like to see the goal statements and would like to take a stab at reframing them that way, we are working with Janet Panak, I think is how she says her name, and we are taking some of her, she doesn't call them goal statements, but Ann and I are trying to revise those so that we can make that available and see whether we can feed that back to the people who visit her website. But yeah, if you have any thoughts about language or want to take a stab at it, please let me know.
I just want to say, as a person who has a family member dealing with CLL, I appreciate the intentional exploration of the conversation, because so many times I've heard that there hasn't been much of a conversation with the oncologist and my father-in-law, and I just appreciate the exploration and getting to a different place.
Thank you. Fingers crossed that we get to a different place. We're definitely planning to take a big swing at it.
It's an ongoing journey.
It's complicated.
Any last questions or comments? Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Kripe, and thank you for the gift to the profession that you're doing with your work.
Thank you. It's my privilege, and thank you to the IU Health Values Fund. That obviously was critical funding for us, and we appreciate it. And thank you all for your time. It's been fun to spend the time with you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a great rest of your Tuesday.